Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Deep State 9/11 and Ecumenical Approach. My name is Frank Tolopko, retired business systems analyst for a major electric power company in New York State, and I'm moderating this panel. Over the decades, I've evolved from a coincidence theorist to a conspiracy theorist. So, there will be a question and answer period at the end, or brief comments also. Think about what you want to ask or say, remembering that shorter questions lead to longer answers and more opportunity for others. So keep that in mind. Thanks a lot. Too many on the putative left have, at best, ignored and shunned, at worst, demeaned and attacked those that attempt to connect and integrate the current state of world affairs to the events of September 11, 2001 and other deep state events. Investigating and propagating the emerging truth about the tragedy of that now iconic day is a, quote, distraction from the real work, close quote, of leftists, progressives, and others seeking a better, more just world, or so they say. We take the opposite approach, an ecumenical approach that is an all-inclusive strategy that intimately ties together all events leading up to 9/11, during 9/11, and post 9/11. To view the events since the end of World War II, a time of increasing U.S. hegemony in the world, and ignore or distort, for example, the Kennedy assassinations, that's plural, the MLK assassination, and the events of September 11th, 2001, including the anthrax letters, truly distracts history and breaks the continuum of world events. Many of these game-changing events have been orchestrated by a deep state. Peter Dale Scott, former Canadian diplomat, professor emeritus, political analyst, and poet, defines, and I paraphrase, a deep state as a larger aggregation of extra-legal powers or forces inside and outside government that include not just covert agencies like the FBI, but also their media allies and other allied elements both in the wealthy overworld and the criminal underworld. This is a deep political system which habitually resorts to decision-making and enforcement procedures outside as well as inside those publicly sanctioned by laws and society. Without this understanding and acceptance of the existence and control of this deep state, virtually all worthy political activism is doomed to fail. The above-mentioned assassinations and self-inflicted terrorist attacks, as well as less traumatic events such as Watergate, are manifestations of this deep state. They have to be. Deep state forces can't always exercise their will and their power out in the open. People would eventually catch on. Better to provide the polis bread, circus, illusion of political power via the ballot box, and promises of protection by the visible political power structure. The deep state understands this. Sadly, too many otherwise dedicated people don't. A partially visible example of this deep state, is the Project for a New American Century, a neoconservative think tank established in 1997. Its stated goal was to promote American global leadership, read hegemony. 10 of the original 25 signers of the founding statement of principles went on to serve in the Bush administration, including Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. A year before the events of 9/11, they published a 90-page report entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. In it, they called for massive increases in military spending, new technologies, and operational concepts over the coming years to establish a new Pax Americana, or some would say Pax Americana. They realized this would be a hard sell to the public, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, close quote. We got our new Pearl Harbor on September 11, 2001. Cui bono, that is, who benefited? Our two panelists today are Barbara Honegger and Kevin Barrett. They will discuss two aspects of the modus operandi of this aforementioned deep state. Ms. Honegger will talk of the importance of the attack on the Pentagon on 9/11 and then Mr. Barrett will examine the unwillingness of the left, as typified by Noam Chomsky, to deal with deep state realities of September 11th. First up is Barbara Honegger. Ms. Honegger has an extensive curriculum vitae. She is a leading researcher, author, and public speaker on the September 11th Pentagon and anthrax letter attacks. She has served in high-level positions in the federal government, including White House policy analyst and special assistant to the president. From 2000 through 2011, she was a senior military affairs journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School, the premier science, technology, and national security affairs graduate research university of the Department of Defense. Ms. Honegger's pioneering book, October Surprise, on the deep story behind the Iran side of the Iran-Contra scandal, now confirmed by formally classified documents, led to a full subpoena power investigation by the U.S. House of Representatives. She is currently a candidate for Congress from California's District 20 and one of 50 founding current and former high-level government, military, and intelligence officials to call for a new, independent 9/11 investigation. Ms. Honegger holds a BA degree from Stanford University, an MS from John F. Kennedy University, and master's level certification in national security decision-making from the Naval War College. Ms. Honegger's video, Behind the Smoke Curtain, What Happened at the Pentagon on 9/11 and What Didn't and Why It Matters, has had almost 200,000 views on YouTube and is available on Amazon.com. I give you Barbara Honegger.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Well, thank you, first of all, to the Left Forum for this historic opportunity to bring you the forensic facts of what really happened and what didn't on 9/11. Before the largest gathering of progressive activists in this country, we in the 9/11 Truth Movement are genuinely grateful for this opening to the facts and are mindful of the great responsibility that comes with it. And we are honored for this opportunity. I wish I could be there. I'm running for Congress here in California's Congressional District 20, which is about 150% job. So that's the reason I wasn't able to be in New York City today. For 15 years since 9/11, the leadership of the progressive left in this nation has tried, as we know, unsuccessfully, to stop a series of unilateral aggressive wars and occupations overseas. Those wars continue to this day, precisely because the root cause of this evil tree has not been cut. That root is the official claim of who attacked our country on 9/11. That official story is a lie, a gigantic blood libel, which it is my goal in this presentation and Dr. Barrett's to expose for all time so that the 9/11 wars can finally be brought to an end and the real perpetrators finally brought to justice. For make no mistake, the real perpetrators of the attacks on our nation on 9/11, as you will see, are still at large. They are armed and they are extremely dangerous. If it is true that the first casualty of war is the truth, then the first casualty of truth can be war. As it will be when the real facts of September 11th reach a critical mass in our body politic, and when the progressive left realizes and acts on the fact that it is the key to achieving that critical mass. This presentation will first and foremost give the evidence. I believe it is absolute proof. I will leave that to your judgment, each of you. Will prove that the official 9/11 narrative, the official 9/11 story, upon which all of these ongoing 9/11 wars, on which the transformation of our Defense Department into what is an offense department with a tripled near $1 trillion annual budget, the global domination agenda, and this grotesque surveillance police state we are in, are all based, is completely false. This presentation will then expose the imminent limited hangout, and I will define that in a moment. The imminent limited hangout that is about to be rolled out in Washington, D.C. by the federal government, all of its branches, to mislead you, the American public, into believing that the, quote, full truth, unquote, of 9/11 will have then finally been told, so that you can then go to sleep and let the offense department continue to do whatever it wants. Now, a limited hangout, very briefly, is when the military intelligence agencies, usually of a country, including our own, have committed an illegal deed, and they are close to being found out. So what they do is they roll out part of the truth in order to try to prevent the media, the Congress, and the people of the country from asking further questions and believing that everything is then known. It's known as a limited hangout in intelligence parlance. So, to begin, first, as they say, just the facts, ma'am, and what facts they are. These facts, which you are about to see for yourself, will prove that the real story, both at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11, is the same, and that real story is pre-placed, pre-planted inside the building explosives with plane approaches and impacts as a deceptively engineered to be misperceived but physically impossible cause of the collapses. Inside explosives take weeks, if not months, to pre-place. In New York City, most controlled, high security, controlled access, high security buildings on this entire planet. The Pentagon and the World Trade Center, and especially World Trade Center 7 in New York City, effectively a federal office building because it housed offices of the CIA, the largest CIA office outside of Langley, Virginia, the FBI, the Department of Defense, the SEC, and the Operations Center of the New York Office of Emergency Preparedness. That zero outside terrorists could ever have had the sustained access to plant, because planting pre-placed explosives requires at least weeks in advance of 9/11. So first, let's look at some of the key evidence at the World Trade Center that proves that the official story of 9/11 is a lie. The evidence compiled by the 9/11 Truth Movement about World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7 is very well known. Both towers were designed specifically to withstand the impact of a large commercial airliner. And no steel frame building, which the towers and all the other buildings in the World Trade Center complex were, have never collapsed due to an impact, fire, or a combination thereof. Not before 9/11, not after, and not on 9/11. That is the official lie. Tall skyscrapers across the world have burned for far longer and far greater fires, even consuming the entire building, and never collapsed, and they never will. It is physically impossible without the pre-planting of explosives. The Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7, the latter not hit by any plane, all three came down in New York City in near free fall speed into effectively their own footprints on 9/11. This is the pattern and signature of classic controlled demolitions with pre-planted explosives. So in New York City on 9/11, 2 planes effectively brought down 3 buildings. This is physically impossible. Now we're going to look at slide 1, and I believe that is already up on the screen. I consider this what I call the most burning data point of all of the World Trade Center events on 9/11 that proves the official story must be a lie, that there is no other possible interpretation. What you are seeing on the screen is a table of the relative times on the morning of 9/11 of a deep basement explosions in both World Trade Centers 1 and 2 before, in both cases, any plane hit the towers, dozens and dozens and dozens of floors higher up in the building. In the case of World Trade Center 7, 3 separate official seismic records show that in the case of World Trade Center 7, there was a huge deep basement explosion 14 seconds before the plane hit World Trade Center 7 way high in the above. In the case of World Trade Center 2, there was a massive deep basement explosion 17 seconds before the plane hit the building at all. These are facts, and they must be taken into account by the American public, by our media, and by our Congress. These are facts. Now, when you do the math, the official story claims that the planes that impacted the World Trade Centers were going over 500 miles per hour. At that speed, at 14 seconds and 17 seconds before impact on the buildings, those planes were approximately half a mile from the towers when the deep basement explosions went off. Therefore, it is a necessary inference and therefore a fact that no onboard pilot of either plane could have been in control of the planes when they impacted the towers. Because any pilot in control of either plane could have veered off in that half mile in those 14 and 17 seconds. So, whoever planted and triggered the deep basement explosives that went off before either plane hit above in the towers also was in control of the planes on 9/11 to guarantee that the towers would be hit. No hijackers, no pilot, hijacker or otherwise, could therefore been in control of the planes that hit the Twin Towers on 9/11, even if, as you will see, there were any hijackers on the planes at all. And we know with 100% certainty, 100%, that no hijacker brought down World Trade Center 7, as it was hit by no plane on 9/11, but also came down at about 5:20 p.m. in the early evening of 9/11 in a classic controlled demolition that requires the pre-placement of inside explosives throughout the building weeks, if not months, before 9/11. And if I could now have slide 2, please, if that could come up on the screen as soon as it could. There it is. Now, slide 2, for those of us in the 9/11 Truth Movement, this is a very famous piece of evidence, but some watching this presentation might not yet be aware of it. It's extremely important. What you are seeing is a photograph of red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other, that are tiny, extremely tiny, in the dust that filled the sky around the World Trade Center on 9/11. These are nanothermite chips, very tiny nanothermite chips in the dust from the World Trade Center. There were also iron microspheres, tiny micro iron spheres in the World Trade Center dust, which were caused by molten iron, a byproduct of the thermite reaction, on the steel columns, cooling and hardening as the dust falls, as the dust fell on 9/11. Both of these facts, the red-gray nanothermate chips and the iron microspheres, are absolute proof that there was military-grade ensulfurated nanothermite planted in the World Trade Center towers on 9/11, which is at least for certain one part of the process by which the controlled demolition was accomplished. Now I'd like to go to the third slide, please, if that could come up on the screen. There it is. What you are now seeing, we're going to move to some of the strongest evidence that proves that the official story at the Pentagon is also a complete lie. Now, what you're seeing here is a graphic from the Pentagon Building Performance Report itself, which is an official report in the wake of 9/11 by a team of professional structural engineers. And in slide 3, we are seeing a graphic of the west wall of the Pentagon, and that on 9/11, and that little red dot is where the official story says a huge Boeing 757, which they claim was Flight 77, hit the building, according to the official story, at almost 9:38 in the morning. At 9:37 and 45 or 46 seconds, according to the official narrative. Now, it's important, I don't have an arrow, however, to show you, but you will see an H there on the ground, and that was the Pentagon heliport. Very important in what really happened at the Pentagon. And to the left or north of that, you will see that small building called a security building. That is a graphic of the Pentagon firehouse, which was actually outside, as you can see, of the Pentagon wall. So we are now going to move to slide 4, but before we do that, slide 4 is going to, in a moment, show you what the lawn looked like, the pristine lawn looked like outside the building, right off of that red dot where the official story says a plane hit going at over 500 miles an hour. So let's have the next slide, which is slide 4. So this is what, right after the alleged impact of a 757 on the Pentagon, at approximately where you see that little bit of fire just to the right and beyond that right green fire truck. And so that is where the official story says there was an impact just a few minutes before this photograph was taken. Now let's go to slide 6. And when that comes up on the screen, no, I need slide 6. This is slide 5. There we go. Slide 6. You are now looking at what the lawn of the Pentagon looked like right after the attack of 9/11 at the Pentagon, right by that Pentagon heliport firehouse that we showed you in that earlier graphic. That's anything but a pristine lawn. And what you are looking at is significantly further to the left along the west wall, or to the north along the west wall, from that alleged official story plane impact point. So you are looking at where the real damage was at the Pentagon, and this is between at least 120 to 150 feet further to the left and north than where the official story says something happened at the Pentagon on 9/11 with a plane. So, as I mentioned, and we can leave that up on the screen for a moment. As the official story again claims that a plane hit the Pentagon where the red dot was shown at almost 9:38. And now let's go to slide 5 for a moment. There we go, slide 5, very important slide. This slide, which I've created by adding the words April Gallup's office and alleged impact point with the red arrows, this is actually another slide from the official Pentagon Building Performance Report showing on the right the alleged impact point, which is where that red dot was in that earlier graphic, and on the left an arrow pointing to just inside the outer E-ring of the 5 rings of the Pentagon, where a very critical Pentagon witness named April Gallup, that's where her desk was. Now, one of the critical burning facts of the Pentagon attack on 9/11 is that April Gallup's huge explosion went off right close to April Gallup's desk, where that left red arrow is, on the morning of 9/11 at 9:30. That's almost 8 minutes before the alleged impact of a plane at the right arrow over 150 feet further to the south along the same west wall of the Pentagon. It is physically impossible for any kindergartner knows for a plane that may or may not, the evidence shows did not, but according to the official story, hit the building where the right arrow is, almost 8 minutes later, caused a massive explosion that killed many people around April Gallup's desk and seriously injured her and her infant son, who was by her desk that morning. She miraculously got out of the building. And she had serious injuries, but she did survive. She was one of the lucky ones who did survive. And we know that that massive explosion near April Gallup's desk went off at 9:30 because it stopped her wristwatch at that time. She has kept the wristwatch, and it is in a safe box at a bank. So when we do finally get to court to bring the real perpetrators of 9/11 to justice, that evidence will be made available to the prosecution. So let us now go to slide 7, if I may. All right, here's slide 7. So in addition, these are clocks that were stopped by violent events at the Pentagon on 9/11. Now, the Pentagon, of course, is the military headquarters of the strongest military power on the planet. And as everyone knows, militaries are highly punctual organizations. You have to have accurate clocks. Now, these are 2 clocks from, in the case of the left clock on the screen, from that very heliport firehouse that you saw outside of the west face of the Pentagon on 9/11. And it is stopped well before the official story alleged impact time of a plane, which the official story claims is almost 9:38. That heliport clock is stopped, as you can see for yourself, at approximately 9:32 and 30 seconds. Now, the clock on the right is also critically important. And by the way, the clock on the left is in the official Smithsonian Institution exhibit of 9/11. The clock on the right has been provided by the Pentagon itself. This photograph, it was from a Defense Department website. The clock on the right is from the Naval Command Center on 9/11, which was not even on the outside ring where the plane allegedly hit. It was on 9/11, it was 2 to 3 rings further in of the 5-ring Pentagon than the outside ring where a plane allegedly hit. 2 and 3 rings in. And this clock is stopped, as you can see for yourself, at 9:31 and 40 seconds. Both clocks, one in the heliport firehouse outside the Pentagon wall, and the other one inside the Pentagon, far further in than the alleged impact point on the Pentagon of a plane, both stopped many, many minutes before the alleged impact of Flight 77 on the building. And in fact, while whatever plane was approaching the building and did get to the building at approximately 9:38, but did not impact the building then, many minutes before, while that plane was many, many miles still outside of Washington, D.C., and nowhere close to the Pentagon. So we can leave. Why don't we go back to that slide 3 of the West? No, let's go back to slide 1 if I could. We could go back to slide 1 for a moment. The one that showed, no, I'm sorry, slide 2, the one that showed the red dot on the side of the wall. If that's, no, this is slide 1, and it would be the next one, I believe. Nope, I guess it's slide 4. There we go. If we could leave that on the screen, thank you. All right, so we'll just leave this on the screen so that reminds you of the relative locations of the alleged impact point, according to the official story, at the red dot at almost 9:38 versus that security building on the left over 150 feet further to the north along the same wall, where you saw that massive fire and destruction and charred lawn and trees outside. And we know that event stopped the heliport firehouse clock, the clock in that little security building there at 9:32 and 30 seconds. While the plane that wouldn't approach the Pentagon for many more minutes was still miles outside of Washington, D.C. So another burning data point about the Pentagon on 9/11. The official story says that a plane penetrated into only the 3rd ring the inside of the third ring of 5 rings of the Pentagon. Now, this is the official claim. However, we know that there were massive fire, deaths, and destruction in the 4th and 5th rings in, further into the building than the 3rd ring in. So any kindergartner, again, can know with 100% certainty that no plane, even if it hit the building the way the official story says, and only penetrated into the inside of 3 of 5 rings, could have been responsible for deaths, fire, and destruction in the 4th and 5th rings into the building. These are facts. Now, slide 9. If we could see slide 9 for a moment. Slide 9, thank you. At the top of slide 9, I need to refer viewers for 3 hours of the evidence. This presentation is too short, only 45 minutes to show you all of the evidence, or more of the evidence, but the definitive evidence and 3 hours of it for what really happened at the Pentagon and what didn't on 9/11 is in it's at the first link on YouTube. That is my presentation with professional graphics, photographs, and video clips that have now been inserted and embedded into it of my presentation at Seattle Town Hall. And I highly recommend that everyone watching this presentation go to that link, write it down, and watch Behind the Smoke Curtain on YouTube. There are now close to 200,000 views on the main Smoke Curtain YouTube alone. All right. Now, I'd like to now finally go to slide 8 about the Pentagon. This is a black and white photograph. There we go. Thank you. So this is an extremely important photograph, probably the most important one of the Pentagon attack entirely. What you are seeing is a composite photograph that is put together because it's difficult to get one photograph of the full width that you are seeing. But these are actual photographs taken of the Pentagon after and put together after the initial fires were already out, but as you can clearly see, before that portion of the building collapsed. And everyone knows that there was this giant black smoke cloud and that there was a collapse of the west wall. In fact, right where you see that, right in the middle of the screen, on the 2nd floor, you see a kind of T shape with blackened out windows on either side. That is on the 2nd floor. And believe it or not, the official story, according to the Pentagon Building Performance Report itself, states that that is precisely where a 757 airliner going at over 500 miles an hour allegedly impacted the building. And yet, as you will see, that is column 14, the official story, alleged impact point of a huge plane. That as you will see, as you see there for yourself, the vertical column 14 of the official story alleged impact point is still present after the alleged impact of a plane. And though it's slightly more difficult to see, just to the right of that, in the floor of the 2nd floor and ceiling of the 1st floor, that floor to the right of the T at the bottom is also still present. It is physically impossible for any object of great weight and force to have impacted precisely where that floor and vertical column 14T is, and for after the impact, for the vertical column 14 and the floor to the right of the 2nd floor to still be present. Physically impossible. So we have now shown you the absolute evidence, and there is massively more of that evidence in Behind the Smoke Curtain, which I've referred you to, proving that the official story at the Pentagon is a lie, and that the real story at the Pentagon, based upon April Gallup and April Gallup's experience, based upon the timing of the stop clocks in the Naval Command Center 2 and 3 rings further in than the alleged impact point, based upon this slide that proves that no plane could possibly have hit the building where the government claims, and have resulted in this vertical column and floor of the second floor still being intact after the alleged impact. The official story at the Pentagon, like at the World Trade Center, is explosives. It is pre-placed inside the building explosives and outside the building explosives. Now, it is important for people to know that there was a plane at the Pentagon, but just as at the World Trade Center, the planes were simply the cover cause. They were the deceptively, near simultaneously engineered cover cause for people to believe that the collapses of the World Trade Center towers in the case of New York City and that section of the west wall of the Pentagon in the case of the Pentagon were caused by the plane impacts and fires therefrom. They could not have been, and they were not. Also, at the Pentagon, literally hundreds of witnesses heard bombs go off, said so, have gone on the record, and there was a massive, overwhelming smell of cordite at the Pentagon on 9/11. Cordite is a cool burning explosive that smells nothing like burning jet fuel. And one of the main witnesses to this overwhelming smell of cordite, and he used that word overwhelming, at the Pentagon was none other than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff himself, General Hugh Shelton, who said so in his memoirs, used the word overwhelming smell of cordite. So what is the bottom line at the Pentagon? Just as at the World Trade Center, the bottom line of the truth is that no outside terrorist, hijacker or otherwise, Al-Qaeda, bin Laden or otherwise, no outside terrorist could ever have had the sustained access to either the World Trade Center or the World Trade Center 7 building in New York City that was effectively a government office building, or to the Pentagon on 9/11, before 9/11, to pre-place inside the building explosives that we have proof were pre-planted in all of those buildings. Now, what I'd like to do is go to that last slide, 9 again, if we could, and put that back on the screen, just so people can write down the links, if we could. So there we go. I would like to also refer people to the second link on the screen. It's very important. The first link is to Behind the Smoke Curtain, which is 3 hours of the definitive evidence that the official story at the Pentagon is the same as at the World Trade Center, which is pre-placed inside the building explosives. But it's just about the Pentagon. And also the last third about who did it, who did this. The second link is very important. I've also produced this. It's the 9/11 Museum virtual walking tour, also on YouTube. And the virtual walking tour is important also because it covers all aspects of 9/11. It covers the World Trade Center, it covers the Pentagon, and it also covers Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and Flight 93. And the wonderful thing about the 9/11 Museum virtual walking tour is that it uses photographs of the actual exhibit items inside the physical 9/11 museum, the official 9/11 museum at Ground Zero, to prove, using their own exhibit items, that the official lie that the museum attempts to cast in stone is a lie. It uses its own exhibit items. And the tour takes you through the museum from beginning to end, and you can actually turn it on with your smartphone and earplugs inside the 9/11 Museum at Ground Zero itself, 7 stories underground. I've tested it, and it works. Myself and Bonnie Faulkner of the magnificent Pacifica radio network station, KPFA, and her wonderful program for over 15 years, Guns and Butter. She and I are your tour guides in the 9/11 Museum Virtual Walking Tour. And the tour is opened and closed by our wonderful friend and colleague, Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son, Bobby, at World Trade Center 1 on 9/11. So I highly recommend that everyone watching this presentation go to both of these YouTubes and take the time. It is your duty as a citizen of this great country to know what is in these. Now, briefly, I'm just going to give you some of the top data points about Shanksville. You learn much more in the 9/11 Museum Virtual Walking Tour using the exhibit items in the museum itself at Ground Zero. But just for now, some of the highlights of the truth about what happened at Shanksville, Pennsylvania on 9/11. The official story claims that Flight 93, with passengers on board, crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. However, that's physically impossible. First off, plane debris from that plane began falling out of the sky 8 miles before Shanksville. The debris field of that plane, like debris fields of the plane that was shot down over Ukraine, it also had a debris field of approximately 8 miles. So also one of the engines of the plane that was destroyed over near Shanksville was cut in half, was cut in two, which would not happen except by either a bomb or a missile, almost certainly a missile. The coroner on the scene at the alleged crash site 8 miles further on in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, said there were simply no bodies there. There was no blood. And also, many people don't realize, you learn this in Behind the Smoke Curtain, that the precise same military plane, a C-130, was at the Pentagon just after the event that caused the big black smoke cloud, which was in a diesel trailer outside the Pentagon, which was the source of what smelled like jet fuel, but was actually burning diesel fuel from a diesel fuel trailer. The precise same C-130 military, U.S. Air Force military aircraft was at the Pentagon just after this event that caused the big smoke cloud and fire in the diesel trailer outside the Pentagon wall. That same C-130 was then sent to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where the pilot of that identical C-130 was the first official source for the official story lie claim about what happened at both the Pentagon and Shanksville alleged crash sites. Now, that is not a coincidence. That was pre-planned to roll out the official story, which was a lie from the very get-go on day one. So what is the bottom line of the evidence that you have just seen, and much more in Smoke Curtain and the 9/11 Museum Virtual Walking Tour? The bottom line is that we need to stop thinking of and speaking of 9/11 as a terrorist attack. It was an attack, but it was not a terrorist attack by an outside terrorist of any kind, or by the definition of terrorism of any means that the public has been led to believe. 9/11 was not a terrorist attack. It had to have been an inside job. The 9/11 attacks were impossible at an absolute minimum without inside official collaboration, if not orchestration at the Pentagon, and impossible without, at a minimum, collaboration by the owner and lessee of World Trade Center 7, Larry Silverstein, and the World Trade Center, other World Trade Center buildings which he leased. He only owned outright World Trade Center 7, which came down in a classic controlled demolition and was not hit by any plane whatsoever. It is impossible without the collaboration by Larry Silverstein and or his building security contractor at the World Trade Center. All right. Now I'm going to move briefly to the second and final part of my presentation, which I call the limited hangout that you are about to experience coming out of official Washington, D.C. And I am talking about what is called the 28 pages of the Joint House-Senate Intelligence Committee investigation report of 9/11, which was the first of the two official reports. The second one was the 9/11 Commission report by our federal government. And this limited hangout is about these 28 pages and the alleged Saudi connection to 9/11. Now, first, everyone in the 9/11 Truth movement, we need to go on record here, does believe that these 28 pages should be declassified and released, despite there being an obvious limited hangout. But when those pages are released, and it now looks like with almost certainty that they will be in the near future, we all need to be fully aware and conscious that the official goal of their release is to try to stop us, to stop you from asking questions, further questions that would lead to the real masterminds and perpetrators of the attacks. Now, once this Saudi connection in the 28 pages has been revealed, the real perpetrators hope that the public will assume and buy that the, quote, full story, I underline the word full, of 9/11 will have been then told, and that the victims' family members of the attacks and all the American people and the people of the world can finally have what they call closure. This is the claim that if the 28 pages are released, that there will then be full public knowledge of what happened on 9/11, is actually in the letter that was sent by the co-sponsors of H.R. 14, which is the House side bill calling for President Obama to declassify and release the 28 pages of the Joint House-Senate Intelligence Committee 9/11 report. In their own letter to President Obama, they state, quote, "We consider this to be a matter of providing the American people with all, underlined all, the facts regarding 9/11 and bringing closure to the many individuals who lost family and friends in those attacks," unquote. And House Resolution H.R. 14 itself states that the declassification and release of the 28 pages is, quote, "necessary to provide the American public with the full truth," underline full, of the events of September 11. But as you have just seen, these 28 pages cannot possibly be anything like the full truth. First, from what has been revealed by members of Congress who have already read the 28 pages, they are only about 2 of the alleged 19 9/11 hijackers, who, by the way, both happened to have been on the alleged Pentagon plane that you have already seen wasn't anywhere near the Pentagon when pre-planted explosives went off by April Gallup's desk almost 8 minutes earlier, before the official story says the plane even arrived. So, information in the 28 pages, when they're revealed finally, about only 2 of the alleged 19 hijackers, even if this information were true, could not ever be the full truth. Second, at least 6 and as many as 10 of the alleged 9/11 hijackers, including the Saudi alleged hijackers, were and are still alive. And they went public saying so after the planes they supposedly were in had crashed into flaming fireballs. The 28 pages won't say anything about that. And if the Saudis are sued by the victims' family members, which it looks like they will be, their first line of defense will be, of course, to call the still alive alleged Saudi hijackers into the courtroom. The 28 pages also will not include why the FBI never included Osama bin Laden on its most wanted list for the 9/11 attacks. When asked why not, Rex Tomb, spelled T-O-M-B appropriately, Rex Tomb, who was the chief investigative spokesperson for the FBI, when he was asked why Osama bin Laden wasn't wanted officially by the FBI for 9/11, his public answer was because the FBI doesn't have and didn't have and doesn't have any definitive evidence whatsoever that bin Laden was associated with the attacks. The 28 pages reportedly include mention of Prince Bandar, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States on 9/11, before, during, and after 9/11, who was so close to the Bush family that they, the Bushes, dubbed him Bandar Bush, which they do to this day. The 28 pages won't say anything about how President Bush and this same Prince Bandar Bush celebrated with cigars on the White House balcony shortly after the 9/11 attacks. The 28 pages won't include anything about the Bush White House arranging for those plane loads of Saudi royal family members and even bin Laden family members to leave this country on specially chartered jets before Americans ourselves were allowed to fly. The 28 pages won't say anything about the 5 dancing Israelis who danced and celebrated the plane impact on the first World Trade Center tower, World Trade Center 1 in New York City, before anyone in the world was supposed to know, except for the alleged hijackers, to know that it was coming. The 28 pages won't say anything about their being arrested, about explosives found in their van, about the lie detector tests they failed, or their being released by dual U.S.-Israeli national Michael Chertoff, who was soon to head our new Homeland Security Department based itself on the official lie of who attacked this country on 9/11, where back in Israel, the 5 dancing Israelis admitted on Israeli television that they had been sent to the United States to, quote, their words, document the event, unquote. The 28 pages will not say anything about that. The 28 pages will say nothing about the strategic relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, or about Prince Bandar Bush meeting with Israel's Mossad intelligence agency and the military dozens and dozens of times, at least as early as 1990, over a decade before the attacks of 9/11. The 28 pages will say nothing about Philip Zelikow, the 9/11 Commission executive director and co-conspirator with White House National Security Council Director Condoleezza Rice, on behalf of President George W. Bush, who wrote the detailed outline for the official 9/11 story contained in the official 9/11 Commission report before the Commission even began its so-called, quote, investigation, unquote. And the 28 pages will not mention that Philip Zelikow, the head of the 9/11 Commission as its executive director, was an expert, according to his own bio, in the, quote, creation and maintenance of public myths. Myth is an official legend. In other words, a lie. Finally, the 28 pages will say nothing about U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki, who, according to the official 911 story, was a key motivator of the very alleged 2 hijackers mentioned in the 28 pages, who was recently revealed to be a trainer and bomb expert to al-Qaeda terrorists. It won't mention al-Awlaki having been invited to a special Pentagon luncheon for so-called, quote, moderate, unquote, Muslims in the wake of 9/11, and having given a sermon at the U.S. Capitol, or al-Awlaki having been exposed as an undercover FBI asset. The 28 pages will also say nothing about the self-proclaimed head of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, our alleged enemy, having been recruited by U.S. Army counterterrorism expert and the first medic at Abu Ghraib prison, Gregory Ford, as a United States military informant, or the fact that when al-Baghdadi was injured on the battlefield, that he was raced to an Israeli hospital where they patched him back to health so they could return him to the battlefield to continue his terrorist acts. According to a recent poll released just April 25th of this year. Almost three-quarters, 74% of the American public wants the U.S. government to release everything about the 9/11 attacks, not just this limited hangout of the 28 pages. 8 pages, the ultimate limited hangout, are finally released. It will not be the full truth of September 11th, not even close. It will not be the end of the story. It will only be the beginning. It is up to us, the American people, and especially the leadership and top opinion makers of the progressive left, to do everything we can to ensure that the real full story is uncovered, told, and acted upon, so that the real perpetrators are finally brought to justice. I thank you for this opportunity to bring the facts to the American people and to the progressive left leadership, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for the riveting talk. You can go to those websites to get even more information. It's a lot of information, and it's got to be taken in small doses. We got plenty of time. Time is on our side. Next up is Dr. Kevin Barrett. Dr. Barrett, a PhD Arabist Islamologist, holds advanced degrees in English literature, French literature, and African literature, and is the author of 3 books, including Questioning the War on Terror, a primer for Obama voters, which was written in 2009, which deconstructs the war on terror, quote unquote, through Socratic questioning. Dr. Barrett was also the lead editor, along with John Cobb and Sandra Lubarsky, of 9/11 and American Empire, Volume 2, Christians, Jews, and Muslims Speak Out. His other books include Another French False Flag, Bloody Tracks from Paris to San Bernardino. Another book is We Are Not Charlie Hebdo, Free Thinkers Question the French 9/11, and Truth Jihad, My Epic Struggle Against the 9/11 Big Lie. Dr. Barrett has taught the French and Arabic languages, African literature, English, humanities, religious studies, and folklore at colleges and universities in the U.S. and abroad. He has been a Muslim since 1993 and is dedicated to spreading the truth to build a sustainable future. He has both a scholarly and personal interest in Islamic spirituality and wrote a PhD dissertation comparing medieval North African saints' legends to contemporary personal experience narratives from the Fez and Ouija regions. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Close enough.
Okay, of Morocco. He is a co-founder of the Muslim Jewish Christian Alliance for 9/11 Truth and Muslims for 9/11 Truth, and has lectured widely throughout the U.S. as well as in Canada and Morocco. Blacklisted from teaching in the University of Wisconsin system since 2006, Dr. Barrett has worked as a talk show radio host, author, public speaker, and congressional candidate in Wisconsin's 3rd District in 2008. One of the best-known critics of the war on terror, Dr. Barrett has appeared on Fox, CNN, PBS, ABC TV, and Univision, and has been the subject of op-eds and feature stories in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, and other publications. I'm sorry for rushing through this quickly, but we'd like to hear everything that Dr. Barrett has to say. I give you Dr. Barrett.
Thanks. Well, thank you. My title is Why Chomsky is Wrong About 9/11. If I tried to cover that in full detail, we'd be here all night. So this is going to be the short version. But let's see, we have the first slide here. He's not wrong about everything, and we'll touch on the points where he's right, and ultimately we'll go through a lot of areas where he doesn't even really rise to the level of being wrong because he's not saying anything coherent. We'll try to find what he does say that's coherent and make some sense of it. So the next slide here is the back cover of his book and my reaction to it. That's Hillary Clinton allegedly witnessing the execution of Osama bin Laden on live simulcast, just like some people are witnessing this speech on live simulcast, and some of them are probably going like this too, putting their hands on their mouths in shock. Actually, Chomsky doesn't tell you in this new version of his book, 9/11, and indeed Chomsky is the man who wrote the book on 9/11 from the viewpoint of the American left. The original version of this book came out in November 2001, and it was reissued in, I think, 2011 as a 10-year anniversary thing. And on the back cover is this picture of Hillary Clinton shocked by bin Laden's execution. Well, Chomsky doesn't even tell you in the book that that picture is simply a photo op and that there was in fact no such live simulcast. This was one of the many lies that were put out and that have been exposed, even in the mainstream in this case. And it's kind of interesting, he would put this on the cover of the book without telling you that they weren't even really watching the alleged execution of bin Laden. He also doesn't go into the many, many other lies about the alleged execution of bin Laden that have been exposed by people like Seymour Hersh, who said that the entire story of the supposed killing of bin Laden is just one big lie. Nothing remotely like that even happened. Next slide. But just because Chomsky can be very, very, very wrong on these matters doesn't mean he's wrong about everything. He's certainly wrong. He's certainly right about this, that the general population doesn't know what's happening and doesn't even know that it doesn't know. It's I guess sort of a counterpart to what Rumsfeld said about the known knowns and the unknown knowns and the known unknown known unknowns. And I guess Noam is on the same page with that. But here's where he's really right. Okay, you got to give him his due. I'm friends with Andrei Volchek, his co-author on Western terrorism. Andrei is a regular global roving correspondent for my radio show, Truth Jihad Radio. Now, Andrei and Noam counted up the victims of Western terrorism since World War II. CIA military interventions all over the world, and came up with something like 55, 60 million people have been murdered by our tax dollars since World War II. Virtually all of them innocent civilians. So he has a point when he points out that these crimes are vastly greater in the number of victims and the overall detrimental impact on humanity than 9/11 taken as one event with only 3,000 people killed and so on. And people like Andrei Volchek are really disgusted at the way Americans have built this false religion around the 9/11 attack, as though this were the worst horrific massacre in all of history, and we've got to devote the rest of our lives to shredding the Constitution and hunting down the evil perpetrators, yada, yada, yada. I understand why people like Chomsky and Volchek find that obnoxious, and I fully agree with that. Okay, let's move to the next slide, which is the front cover of Chomsky's reissued book on 9/11. The real question is not the subtitle, was there an alternative? What is that supposed to mean? The real question is, was there an alternative interpretation back in 2001 when it mattered the most? And of course the answer is not in Chomsky's book, which was a quote-unquote surprise bestseller. As we see in the next slide, it really went viral. People were shocked and wanted to hear from somebody they trusted about what this meant, what happened, what it meant. And Chomsky really failed in his role as a sort of a figure of guidance and wisdom for the American left by putting out this book that's full of, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on simulcast, total, complete bullshit. Let's look at some of it. This book simply takes for granted, next slide, from page 1, that America's foreign victims or foreigners or foreign attack is repeated over and over. It takes for granted that this was an attack by foreigners on Americans. And this is repeated so many times in this book, 9/11, which consists of a series of interviews that Chomsky did in the couple of months after 9/11, that in the second edition they actually had to edit these out to prevent it being overly repetitive. Foreign attack, foreign attack, foreign attack, foreigners, Americans, foreign victims. They edited out whole sections, such as the section on page 67. Over and over we hear Chomsky say, for the first time since the War of 1812, America has actually been attacked in its homeland. So it's not like Pearl Harbor. Totally misleading comparison. Indeed, the psychological impact was virtually identical to Pearl Harbor as it had been scripted and designed to be. The second bullet point here he makes a very good point. The proper term would be crime, but that requires solid evidence, and it opens doors to dangerous questions. To mention the most obvious one, if it's a crime, right, and you're thinking, well, who done it, right? No, the most obvious one is, who were the perpetrators of the crime of international terrorism condemned by the World Court 15 years ago, 15 years before 2001? Wait a minute. If we should have looked at 9/11 as a crime, the most obvious question is, sleight of hand, let's look at 15 years ago when the U.S. was condemned in the International Court for its terrorist activities in Nicaragua. That's the most obvious question? When there's a huge crime that changes world history, the most obvious question isn't who did it and why. The question is, well, what about that court case 15 years ago? Wow, that's a very strange sentence. What kind of mind could construct that sentence? I guess a brilliant linguistic mind, maybe, I don't know. Then third bullet point here, how about the interviewer, right? This is right in the first couple pages of the book. The interviewer asks him, could you say something about the connivance and the role of the American Secret Service? Could you? Well, and Chomsky not only couldn't, he professes not to understand the question. And then he says the attack was surely an enormous shock and surprise to the intelligence services of the West. Okay, we'll see what kind of shock and surprise it was. Not only did we have President Bush and Bandar Bush smoking cigars to celebrate the success of the attack on the White House balcony the next day, but we also had all sorts of reports that we know that the intelligence services knew it was coming, and actually many of them were celebrating it afterwards. For instance, Bob Barrett, former top U.S. CIA on-the-ground guy for the entire Middle East, the best agent we had in the Middle East, said that he was told that by a top-level intelligence official that when the smoke clears, Americans will see that September 11th was a triumph for the intelligence community, not a failure. Okay. Now, what could that possibly mean? A triumph for the intelligence community? Well, it's pretty obvious. They did it. They got away with it. They got what they wanted. Well, how could you possibly construe that statement from the top of the American intelligence community in any other way? You couldn't. And then we have the New York Times in 2005 reporting the same thing, which we actually have heard many times. Top CIA officials tell us that the intelligence community's handling of 9/11 was not a failure, but something, quote unquote, good, positive, extraordinary. Top of the CIA crowing that 9/11 was good, positive, extraordinary. This was the shock and surprise that Chomsky was trying to tell us back in 2001? I don't think so. Shock and surprise. How about the next slide with Susan Lindauer, a CIA asset who was held incommunicado in solitary and on the Patriot Act in the U.S. military base to keep her mouth shut, was watching this 9/11 on television on the phone with Richard Fuse, her CIA case officer, who was later paid a couple of $1 million in hush money. And they'd known this was coming. They knew there was going to be a huge terrorist attack on Lower Manhattan in late August, early September, to be blamed on Iraq, or rather blamed on Iraq, at least as one of its purposes. And on 9/11, she's on the phone with Fuse, and he starts screaming as he watches the towers blowing up, "The goddamn Israelis! The goddamn Israelis!" Well, he's now living in a multi-million-dollar mansion in Washington, D.C. That he bought with his hush money. So that was not exactly a shock and surprise. Well, I guess it was a shock and surprise to Richard Fuse that they went that far, but they sure knew it was coming. How about the next slide? Randy Glass, FBI informant, former jewel thief, got into basically selling Stinger missiles to terrorists and busting them, sting operations. Randy Glass learned from his contacts that the World Trade Center was going to be destroyed in September 2001. He learned this in early summer 2001, tried to do something about it, went to the Senator Graham in Florida's office. He was rebuffed. He ended up being steered to Colin Powell's right-hand man, Mr. Francis X. Taylor, who you see in the lower slide. That's Francis X. Taylor with his Patterns of Global Terrorism 2001 placard behind him. Francis X. Taylor picked up the phone and said, "Randy, we know about the planes that are going to hit the towers." Now that's very interesting because Randy had never heard it was planes. He just heard the whole World Trade Center was going to be destroyed. He didn't know how. And Francis X. Taylor says, you got to keep your mouth shut about this. Don't talk to anyone about it. Don't talk to your FBI colleagues about it. Quote unquote, we're tiptoeing through a nuclear minefield now. That was the direct quote from Francis X. Taylor, Colin Powell's right-hand man, telling Randy Glass to keep his mouth shut about the upcoming destruction of the World Trade Center by means of planes hitting the towers. All of this is going on in the summer of 2001. What an enormous shock and surprise. And then let's not even get into Bush knew, the bin Laden determined to attack the United States briefing that Condoleezza Rice, who was on record saying, who could imagine such a thing, actually had to admit that this briefing was given to Bush in August of 2001. And Bush snapped angrily at the briefer, well, you've covered your ass now. What could that possibly mean? Other than they're all on board with this. What an enormous shock and surprise of the intelligence community. Such a shock and surprise that all kinds of people, important people, were told not to fly on 9/11, including Willie Brown, the mayor of San Francisco, and Salman Rushdie, the famous author in hiding from the angry Muslims, who his security detail has pretty good intelligence connections. He was also told not to fly on 9/11. What an enormous shock and surprise by his security detail. And we don't know where they got the word from. We had the Odigo instant message warning that went out a couple hours before the attacks in Hebrew, telling this Israeli-based company's messaging system audience to stay out of lower Manhattan. And this is from Haaretz. It's not some kind of anti-Semitic rumor or something. It's a legitimate news story from Haaretz. Sorry, that was the next slide. We're a couple of slides behind here, I guess. So yeah, Rushdie. Move on to Haaretz, and then Haaretz. Haaretz. Okay, there's a little apostrophe in there. Haaretz. I'm still working on my Arabic. I don't know if I'll have enough lifetimes to get to Hebrew. Thank you. So here we have Zim Shipping Company that's half owned by the state of Israel and the other half by the Rothschilds, I believe, moving out, breaking its, 30 years was it? It had a 30-year lease at the World Trade Center, and they broke that lease and lost a huge pile of money by moving out very, very quickly 1 week before 9/11. It certainly didn't come as a huge shock and surprise to them. Next slide. We had, as Barbara mentioned, Israelis set up to film the attacks before the first plane hit. Then they wildly celebrated the success of the attacks, holding up cigarette lighters photographing and videoing themselves in front of the burning and then exploding towers. They were held for a couple of months after they were arrested. They were found with thousands of dollars of cash in their socks. They worked for Urban Moving Systems, owned by Dominic Suter, who was on the FBI terror watch list and fled the country immediately after 9/11. I think he was actually wanted. But now he's back in New York. He's in New York State at large. Anyway, these guys worked for Suter and the Mossad, and there they were celebrating the attacks, got caught, held for, 2 months, and then released by Chertoff, as Barbara said. They went back to Israel and bragged about it on Israeli TV, saying that they had been sent there, quote unquote, to document the event. All of this in mainstream Israeli media. Somehow it didn't seem to filter through the gatekeepers here in the United States. So it certainly didn't come as a huge shock and surprise to them. It came, well, maybe a sort of pleasant surprise that it worked out the way they'd planned. I don't know. And in terms of shock and surprise to everybody in the intelligence community, oh, come on. Here we have Cossiga, the former Italian president, pointing out that all the intelligence services in the U.S. and Europe know that this attack was planned by the Mossad with the aid of the Zionist world in order to accuse the Arabic countries and launch these wars on Muslim countries. Everybody knows that. There's no shock and surprise. It's not quite true that everybody knows it, because the intelligence world is a little bit compartmentalized and some people are very tunnel vision on their own tasks. But everybody in the intelligence world above a certain level and above a certain level of sophistication certainly does know it, as he said. And many of them knew it back in September of 2001. Here Chomsky, this is another quote from his book 9/11, tells us that Al-Qaeda is so decentralized and so lacking in a hierarchical structure and so dispersed through much of the world as to be largely impenetrable. We've heard this over and over. Oh, we couldn't possibly infiltrate Al-Qaeda. Well, we created them. The word Al-Qaeda in Arabic means database. It's the database of CIA Mujahideen fighters that were basically American mercenaries. What do you mean you can't penetrate them? You created them. You have the dossier. And here's Mohammed Haikal speaking on October 10th, 2001. Mohammed Haikal is a high-level former Egyptian government civil servant who personally supervised the infiltration of Al-Qaeda for the Egyptian government, among many other things. He is the Arab world's most prestigious political commentator, bar none. You see him quite often on Al Jazeera, and as he points out, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have been completely blanketed by absolute surveillance for many years by many Western-based intelligence agencies. Obviously, they couldn't keep anything like 9/11 a secret. Next slide. Haikal isn't the only very, very high-level Muslim government person pointing this out. We have this General Gul, who just recently passed away, former ISI director in Pakistan, who gave this very early interview, still in September 2001, in which he pointed out that Mossad and its accomplices, and he said specifically people in the U.S. Air Force, he pointed to, did 9/11. And I mean, again, this is not a secret in Pakistan. A world public opinion poll shows that in Pakistan, only 2% of Pakistanis believe the official story that Arab hijackers were responsible for 9/11. 2%. I guess the other 98% doesn't believe it. Another great Chomsky line from his book 9/11 is he said, I do not think that 9/11 will lead to a long-term restriction of rights internally in any serious sense. What planet was he living on? All the rest of us, everybody I knew that it was time, we're moving into Gestapo police state mode. And today we have this son of Awlaki, this guy is Abdurrahman Awlaki, who was murdered by a drone when he was 16. He's an American citizen, never been accused of anything, much less convicted, like his father, who was never convicted or indicted for anything either, as far as I believe, but they were just preemptorily murdered by a drone strike. Today, the national security state says it can kill anybody, anywhere, American citizen or no, for any reason with no due process whatsoever. The U.S. Constitution is a dead letter. And yet, here's Chomsky telling us, oh no, there'll be no restrictions on anybody's rights. Of course not. I think the word wrong doesn't even begin to cover that. Next slide. Chomsky has a very interesting view of how power works in the U.S. It's not entirely wrong, but it leaves out some of the most important things. He says, sure, there are barriers to the free flow of information, but they cannot be blamed on government censorship or pressure, a very marginal factor in the United States. Well, tell that to Paul Wellstone, his wife, his daughter, and his campaign staff were all murdered because they were trying to get out some information to stop the Iraq War and to look into 9/11. Tell that to the senators who received the anthrax letters, Daschle and Leahy. Daschle and Leahy were about to lead what would have been a successful effort to stop the Patriot Act, and suddenly they got anthrax in the mail. I wouldn't call that marginal government pressure. And it was U.S. government anthrax, of course. Sending people anthrax is really, I think that qualifies as government pressure. Tell that to the hundreds, well, there's 50 in this book, hit list, but there were undoubtedly hundreds of people murdered to cover up the JFK assassination. I'm told by intelligence sources that I can't confirm that probably hundreds have also been killed to cover up 9/11, including many people here in New York, supposedly killed to cover up the issue of the exploding vans, the attempts to blow up the bridges and tunnels on 9/11. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't had that fully confirmed. But in any case, murdering hundreds and hundreds of people to cover up high crimes of state is hardly, I think we could call that government pressure or censorship. Next slide. And then we have the CIA owning everybody of any significance in the major mainstream media, as we're told by former CIA Director William Colby before his unfortunate boating accident. I wouldn't call this a marginal factor. If they own everybody of any significance in the mainstream media, which is obvious that they do, just look at the mainstream media, read 2 or 3 stories in today's New York Times. I mean, that's a marginal factor? I don't think so. I mean, these other factors Chomsky talks about in his book Manufacturing Consent are real too. But why is he leaving this out? Okay, next issue. The real issue, as he said, it was a crime. So who done it? And Chomsky admits in his book 9/11 that evidence is very hard to find, but nevertheless, despite the slim evidence, the initial conclusion that was come to after a few seconds after the planes hit about 9/11 is presumably correct. The initial conclusion that was fed to the world by Ehud Barak in a BBC studio in London just minutes after the tower was hit, he knew when to be in the studio, didn't he? That Al-Qaeda did it, and he gave us the whole program. The entire post-9/11 program was fed to the world through BBC by Ehud Barak in the studio, and that was the initial conclusion. And Chomsky is telling us, oh yeah, it's probably correct, so let's not even doubt it. Why would we do that? Why would we accept this official conspiracy theory that's based on thin evidence, which is even an overstatement? I mean, that means there is some evidence. And in fact, there's no convincing evidence that any single element of the official story is true. But okay, let's say there's a little bit of very, very thin evidence. Why would we believe that? The people feeding us this thin evidence are the people who benefit the most from the crime. Why is this presumably correct? What has Chomsky been smoking? Next slide. Now we're moving out of his book 9/11 into some of his statements that have come thereafter, and they really haven't changed very much. Here he says, he keeps repeating that there's a minuscule number of architects and engineers questioning 9/11. Well, that might have been true back in 2004 when I was doing teach-ins at the University of Wisconsin, and I would occasionally run into engineers who would debate with me, and they would say things like, "What are you talking about? The towers just fell instantly the second the plane hit them. The plane just destroyed their structure and they just fell. What are you talking about?" Say, no. It took 45 minutes for tower to. So anyway, after my conversations with architects and engineers, especially at Wisconsin in 2004, I was afraid to go in any buildings or even fly in. I didn't want to be in any structures built by these people if they were that clueless. But gradually, the architects and engineers caught up with people like me, humanities PhDs, and realized that this is completely ludicrous. That, it's a third-grade science problem to see that none of this is even remotely physically possible. So here's Chomsky telling us that a minuscule number, which is now up to 2,500, question 9/11. Okay, glad to hear that. Next slide. Chomsky feeds us a line of BS that when you think you've discovered something, you must go through the scientific journals and publish it peer-reviewed, blah, 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 even if it's something that a third-grade science student can see if they have eyes. Okay, and of course we have more than 30 peer-reviewed science 9/11 truth papers today. There are a lot of them. It takes years to get through the peer review process. But the real point here is, as we see in the next slide, that what we're talking about here isn't like really a scientific dispute. We're talking about people who are putting forth wings on pigs narratives, which is our next slide. I guess we went past the wigs on pigs, didn't we? Or no, we didn't. This is the Jonathan Ravusky, recent radio guest, is responsible for this. He points out that in order to make the most obvious common sense observation about the world, such as pigs do not fly, bears do shit in the woods, you must possess multiple doctorates from MIT. Okay, thank you. And Chomsky repeatedly hammers on this. What are your qualifications for noticing that a building that comes down at free fall acceleration through the path of most resistance must have had its vertical support members removed by explosives? That sort of thing. Well, every single element, as we see in the next slide, of this 9/11 official myth is a wings on pigs narrative. There's no dispute about it. The notion, the story, the official story, Muslim hijackers hijacked flights that smashed into buildings, causing collapses, and we know this because we found these evidence in these suitcases, these magic suitcases. 2 magic suitcases of Muhammad Atta just showed up, along with the torture testimony. That's the whole basis of this story. We have these passports showing up in the rubble at 2 of the crash sites, 2 of the sites that just came out of nowhere, hijackers' passports. We have these tortured confessions that prove it, and then we have this wings on pig narrative of the Osama bin Laden killing. This whole thing is a ludicrous fantasy that wouldn't pass muster with the people who are employed to check on realistic elements in Hollywood scripts. Next slide. We hear that there is, in fact, just overwhelming evidence that the Bush administration wasn't involved in 9/11. It's very elementary evidence. You don't have to be a physicist to understand it. You just have to think for a minute. Okay, well, so maybe Chomsky says you don't need multiple doctorates from MIT to understand his point here. What is his point? Next slide. I guess it's this. Bush is innocent. Yucky Frog did 9/11. No. Next slide. Let's. Actually, Chomsky's telling us that this is the main point he's used over and over and over to argue that, in fact, it couldn't have been an inside job because they would have used Iraqi hijackers. So he's just taking for granted that the entire purpose of 9/11 was to launch a war in Iraq, and that there would be no way you could launch a war in Iraq based on the public relations effect of a new Pearl Harbor like 9/11 that had hijackers from Saudi Arabia, that was 15 of them, as well as Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon. Okay? Now that is a very, very weak argument, to say the least. Number one, it's been disproven by history. It was very easy to launch a war on Iraq based on what was acts committed by Muslim patsy hijackers that the public can barely distinguish between these different Muslims. And perhaps more importantly, The purpose of 9/11 was not simply to launch the war on Iraq. The purpose of 9/11 was to, well, there are many purposes. I think the biggest geostrategic purpose was to launch a 100 years war on Islam for Israel. And we're seeing this every day. The Islamophobia that's driving all of these conflicts is the direct result of 9/11, as well as the precursors that set 9/11 up as a conceivable reality. That would be the false flags, the African embassies and the USS Cole, and the subsequent false flags since 9/11 to keep the pot boiling. All of this is designed to enable a permanent war of the entire West, especially the US, against the enemies of Israel. And of course, there are other geostrategic benefits as well. So this taking for granted that simply it was all about Iraq is, of course, absurd. Next slide. Chomsky tells us that it's very, very safe to question 9/11. It's risk-free, and the worst thing that could ever happen is people will laugh at you. Well, tell that to Danny Jawenko, Europe's leading controlled demolition specialist, who came out and it was caught by surprise saying, of course, Building 7 is obvious controlled demolition. This was a really amazingly proficient team of engineers that did this. Look at how it comes straight down, straight into the ground. This isn't just a controlled demolition. This is a really, really good one. And then he ends up dying in a mysterious single-car crash. Then there's the next slide is Michael Meacher, the former environmental minister in the UK. He's very, very close to the current head of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn is a 9/11 truther as well. I hope he has honest security, because Michael Meacher, who was Jeremy Corbyn's main 9/11 truth advisor, just turned up dead overnight. He was in perfect health, no sign of any problems, and then he just turned up dead several months ago. And Corbyn had probably better watch his back as well. Again, Chomsky tells us that this is the safest thing you could do is question 9/11. Well, Michael Meacher, who put out a number of brilliant 9/11 truth pieces back earlier on and then had his life threatened and shut up for a long time, but kept advising people like Jeremy Corbyn, is now dead. Next slide, we have the report on Corbyn. Corbyn is also pro 9/11 truth, and of course he got that information from Meacher, who recently appears to have been murdered. Underlining the point, it's not always all that safe to support these kinds of inquiries. We have Beverly Eckert, next slide. She was the most outspokenly pro full 9/11 truth leading family member. The Jersey Girls right now, as you may know, are pushing for this 28 pages that blames the Saudis as what Barbara called a limited hangout. Beverly Eckert wasn't down with any limited hangouts. And right after meeting with President Obama, this outspoken pro 9/11 truth family member went down in a plane crash that killed a large number of people. This is not particularly uncommon. Other examples of big plane crashes killing very large numbers of people to target one single individual would be the plane crash that killed Dorothy Hunt, the wife of E. Howard Hunt, during the Watergate cover-up of the JFK assassination. I forget how many people that one killed to get her. And we've also learned from John Perkins, the economic hitman, that his friends, the jackals and the asteroids, that they send in to kill heads of state who mess with the IMF and the World Bank, are specialists in causing plane crashes. And indeed, they don't just target one person. They'll take down a whole plane full of people, just like they took down the whole plane full of Wellstone, his wife, his daughter, and his campaign staff to stop him from reopening 9/11. Again, Chomsky is wrong. This isn't necessarily the most absolutely safe thing that you could do. Next slide. Another 9/11 truth casualty was Hunter S. Thompson, one of America's most influential journalists. He got 9/11 right from the get-go, and he was about to try to blow it all wide open when he was suicided. And speaking of suicided, next slide, we have Philip Marshall with his kids, Alex and Michaela, who all died in another of these suicidings a couple of years ago. Wayne Madsen thinks that Marshall was probably killed because he had gotten information that the planes that were supposedly used on 9/11 are still parked in the Boneyard, which is a junkyard for aircraft in Arizona. That's Wayne's best guess. In any case, Philip Marshall had written a couple of 9/11 truth books. As a former CIA drug pilot, he wasn't supposed to do that. Next slide. We have a number of scholars who've had their careers prematurely terminated, including me. I lost $2 million in projected lifetime earnings by being witch hunted out of the University of Wisconsin in a way that made me permanently unemployable here in the United States. And there are several others as well. Stephen Jones was forced into early retirement. He's the guy who studied the nanothermite demolition. We have four. He was forced out of Brigham Young after Bush administration. People went to Utah and strong-armed his superiors at that university. Four Arrows, the co-author of American Assassination, The Strange Death of Paul Wellstone, was forced out of the University, I believe, of Arizona, and he's indeed been living in exile from the United States for talking about the truth of 9/11 as well as the Wellstone assassination.
Say his name again?
That's Four Arrows.
Four Arrows?
Four Arrows, yeah. His American name, I think, is Don Jacobs, but he goes by Four Arrows. He's a very, very widely published and very, very wise Native American studies scholar. Judy Wood was forced out of her job, I think it was at Clemson. She's done unorthodox work on the possible demolition modalities. And then we just had James Tracy, another pro-9/11 truth professor, forced out for his discussions of what may and may not have taken place at Sandy Hook. So again, it's not necessarily all that safe to talk about this stuff, even if you're tenured. Steve Jones and James Tracy, and I believe Four Arrows too, I think they were all tenured. All 3 out of 4 of these people were tenured, and they've still been fired for going after the truth on these crimes. So next slide. It's not just that you can't talk about it and you might lose your career, might lose your job, and might lose your life, but you can't even debate it. Nobody's allowed even to support the official story in a debate. At the University of Wisconsin, I put up a challenge. A backer said $1,000 honorarium for anybody who will try to support the official story in a debate with me. I've been blacklisted. I've lost my job. I was teaching at Wisconsin from 95 to 2006. Can't teach there anymore. Well, please explain to me why I'm wrong. Won't somebody explain why I'm wrong? And indeed, newspapers in Wisconsin editorialized that the university needs to find at least one specialist or professor to come and explain why I'm wrong in a debate with me. And guess what? They won't do it, not for $1,000, not for $2,000. This offer has been standing for many years, I think since 2010 or so, and before that it was just without money. And nobody will defend the official story of 9/11, no matter how much you pay them. It's completely forbidden. This is not the safest thing you can do. It is an area of absolute imposed silence. Next slide. So Chomsky tells us that it doesn't matter who carried out 9/11. Now, he's denied saying this, but he has said it in various words, various times. He says, even if these conspiracy theories were true, which is extremely unlikely, who cares? I mean, it doesn't have any significance. Again, this is a kind of argument that on its face, it doesn't even rise to the level of being wrong, because it has to mean something. It has to have some kind of coherence or be in some kind of discernible relationship with consensus reality to be wrong. And this is so bizarre, so Alice in Wonderland-ish, that you can't even say he's wrong. But let's try to be charitable. And I will, in just a moment, suggest a way of interpreting what he may be trying to say. In the next slide, he charges that the 9/11 truth movement is, quote, unique in its unwillingness to think through simple questions. Let's suppose it turns out that the World Trade Center was destroyed by a controlled demolition. Then who would the finger point to? Osama bin Laden, obviously. Now, I don't think you had to have seen Barbara Honegger's deconstruction of who had security at the World Trade Center and how Building 7 was the highest security building outside of Langley, Virginia in the United States to know that this is complete gibberish. Osama bin Laden, the guy over in the cave in Afghanistan, is going to engineer the 3 most sophisticated controlled demolitions of high-rise buildings ever conducted in history. The tallest building ever taken down in controlled demolition before 9/11 was about 30 stories. So Building 7 was half again, maybe close to twice as tall as the tallest building ever taken down in controlled demolition in history. That's Building 7, 47 stories. How about the towers, 110 stories each? These were really feats of controlled demolition engineering. The idea that bin Laden and his gang of ragtag CIA mercenaries over in Afghanistan would have this kind of access to the Trade Center and this kind of sophisticated demolition technology is absurd on its face. And somebody as smart as Chomsky really should know that, I would think. Next slide. Okay, let's give Chomsky a break here. Let's imagine, is there any kind of reality or rationale behind some of these things that he's saying? Well, it's true that when we, again, as I said earlier, when we compare the 3,000 people killed on 9/11 to the 60 million killed abroad by the USA in acts of state terrorism since World War II, in that case, that number 3,000 adds up to a pretty insignificant atrocity in compared with all of these thousands and thousands of other atrocities. So, okay, but does that really make 9/11 insignificant? Next slide. Martha Stout, who is one of our leading experts on psychopathy, which is probably a very important topic when we study the power elite and how they operate, has cited clinical research showing that about half, a little under half, of the American population, which adds up to close to 150 million people, suffered from clinical PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, simply as a result of the TV images that they watched on 9/11. Clinical PTSD. Normally, to get clinical PTSD, you have to have been killing people in the trenches. You have to have watched your buddy's head blown off. You know, you had to have been through some pretty intense, nasty stuff in wartime to get PTSD. But half the American population here got it from watching TV images. What does that mean? Well, that means that this was the most psychologically significant single event in the entire history of humanity, with the possible exception of the alleged crucifixion of Jesus. And I say alleged crucifixion of Jesus because according to Muslim scholarly disputes, there's one camp that claims that according to the Quran, maybe Jesus wasn't really crucified, and there's another camp that says, well, no, he probably was, but that's not the point. The point is his teachings. Its point is to try to be like Jesus, not to get all freaked out about his crucifixion. Okay, whatever the truth of that may be, the image of Jesus' crucifixion did have a profound, tremendous effect on human history. No question about it. For details, read René Girard. But leaving that aside, that's the only other single event that could conceivably have had such a powerful psychological impact on the human species. This is it, 9/11. How could Chomsky be telling us it's not important? I think it's, in a sense, it's a kind of, you could look at it as irony. He's saying the exact opposite of what he must really mean. What he must really mean is that it's too important. It's so cataclysmically important that we really can't deal with it. And indeed, that may be what he really thinks. I've had discussions with Andrei Volchek, Chomsky's close collaborator, about this. And Andrei, he can't give me a clear and coherent case, but he does say that Chomsky just thinks that strategically, the best approach for stopping the bad guys and saving the world and getting justice and all of this is to do it his way, not to go through 9/11 truth. And that would imply that although Andrei hasn't told me this directly, that Chomsky actually really does know the truth about 9/11, and all of this is outrageous double talk or whatever. I don't know. I've heard that from other sources as well. There's a source in Colorado, but it's secondhand, that says that Chomsky way back early on explained that he did know that it was an inside job. So putting two and two together, maybe it's a case of his thinking that trying to, if he were to join the truth movement, he would be marginalized or worse. It wouldn't really change anything. This left that he's tried to build up and become the pope of over the years wouldn't really benefit from it, whatever. Or as he said about the JFK assassination, he said, if this really was an inside job, if they really did kill JFK, they have so much power that if we go up against them, we'll lose. Maybe that's what he's thinking. I don't know. But I would disagree with that. As I told Andrei Volchek, strategically, I think that if we accept that official version of 9/11 as he has and let it go unchallenged, we're left with all of the negative effects. And that we'll never get out of them, because when you brainwash people below the level of consciousness with this paranoia switch kind of instilled fear response that Martha Stout talks about psychologically, it's all operating at an unconscious emotional level. And no amount of conscious deliberation and argumentation is ever going to change the overall body of opinion, or the overall body of consciousness of the people. There's a kind of momentum that's been built up by people's being inculcated with this official picture of 9/11 that is rolling, it's a boulder rolling down a mountain, and all of the rational arguments you want to make about how, well, the West commits far more terrorism anyway, and da-da-da-da-da, all of this Chomsky's way of going about this, I would argue, actually is ultimately pretty futile, because that boulder is just going to keep rolling over you and crush you. On the other hand, if the truth about these psychologically shocking events, or rather if the psychologically shocking truth of these kinds of events, JFK assassination or 9/11, does in fact emerge, that could actually change things. I think we can say for a pretty, well, I think we can accept that, say, on November 23rd, if somehow the story had broken that this was a coup d'etat by the CIA and the plutocracy behind them, that the American people who loved John F. Kennedy, they'd completely fallen for his charisma, would have arisen in revolt, and we would have had serious change. Likewise, when Dr. King was murdered by the CIA, FBI, and the U.S. Army snipers, had that been fully exposed to the American people, we wouldn't have had just a few riots here and there. We would have had the whole country rising up, which is what we need. And that's precisely what would happen if instead of giving us this line of bullshit in November of 2001, if Chomsky had eloquently pushed the whole left towards just looking at Building 7 and drawing the obvious conclusions, I think we would be living in a very different and vastly better world today. And I think that this goes even for the place where we're at now. I think I just got a comment from one of my listeners, very, very wise comment. He said, if we expose the full truth of 9/11 today, it won't really matter, because this unconscious inculcation of Islamophobia has been driven so deep into people that it's going to keep doing its work, even if we expose 9/11. Possibly, I don't know if that's true. I certainly have seen that there are quote-unquote 9/11 truthers like Alex Jones, who are the most raving, outrageous Islamophobic bigots that you'd ever encounter. There are people in the so-called 9/11 truth movement who are actually operating robotically with their deep unconscious minds programmed to Islamophobia by 9/11, by the trauma response engineered through 9/11, and they see through the 9/11 hoax, but they're still acting like Islamophobic robots. They've been fully programmed at an unconscious level by 9/11, and the conscious truth doesn't help them at all. So what do we need? We need the full truth, the cognitive, empirical truth, but we of course also need the emotional, human element as well to get off this track. And I do think that exposing the mechanism, exposing the mind control mechanism, ultimately has a significant chance of stopping the mind control program. So ultimately, as my last slide, I believe, has it, oh no, second to last slide, next slide, we have this prediction by Ash Carter, John Deutsch, and Philip Zelikow made in 1998 in Foreign Affairs magazine. They're speculating about what would happen if the World Trade Center were destroyed. Okay, that's an interesting speculation in 1998. It would be a watershed event in American history. And finally, the last sentence, most important sentence, like Pearl Harbor, this event would divide our past and future into a before and an after. Okay. Now, Philip Zelikow is a specialist in the construction and maintenance of public myths. That's his self-given job description. He knows that myths are foundational narratives that create the identity of social groups. Christian identity is based on the mythic event of Jesus' life and crucifixion, so it divided time into BC and AD, or whatever, Common Era. Same thing with Islam. Our calendar starts with the Hijrah of Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him. Okay, and there's a before, a Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance, and the after. Here in the United States, the before was before the American Revolution. Then we have all these myths, heroic myths, foundational myths about the American Revolution. And those stories divide our time into a before, this nebulous pre-colonial world, and an after, the United States of America as we know it today. This is how foundational myths work. Zelikow knows this. That's his specialty. He's, of course, the guy who wrote the entire 9/11 Commission report in chapter outline before the commission even had convened, as Barbara said. And here he is in 1998 telling us what's coming. The World Trade Center is going to be destroyed, and it'll separate time into a before and an after. So next slide. we're living right now in Zelikows after, and the only way we'll ever get out of it is through full 9/11 truth at every level, both the empirical level and the deep emotional level, working out that trauma and freeing our minds from the conditioning that's led us to go down this horrible path towards destroying the American Constitution, propping up the most repressive forces all over the world, and engaging in these endless, futile, mindless wars of aggression all over the world. So 9/11 truth is the only way we're ever going to get there. And maybe someday Noam Chomsky will actually realize that. I was hoping he would show up here like Marshall McLuhan in that Woody Allen film Annie Hall to explain why I'm wrong, but he hasn't. I'm going to end it here. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I just want to make, we're going right to the question and answers section, but I just want to make two quick comments as a form of postscript. I went to the 9/11 Memorial Museum after it opened, briefly, soon after it opened, and after going through the museum and realized some of the stuff was bullshit, I went to the bookstore and the memorabilia store, and some of the memorabilia was rather tasteless as far as I'm concerned. But I looked at the books, and of course there's books about, talking about escaping from the World Trade Center, etc. But I was looking for books that might have presented the opposing side. There was one book there, Chomsky's 9/11, was there on display as the one book because they wanted to show they wanted to have a balance, a fair and balanced. Number two. I made a friend after 9/11, had met. He happens to be a math professor, and he's also a very accomplished amateur magician. And I gave him the 9/11 stuff, and he came back to me after 2 months after seeing the films and reading the books. He says, Frank, 9/11 is the world's biggest magic trick. Mm-hmm. And he's an illusionist. It's the world's biggest illusion. Anyway, okay, let's...
Yeah, I wanted to mention, I confronted...
Make it short because I have to repeat.
Okay, I confronted Chris Hedges on this, especially Building 7, and he punted. He said, I'm not an engineer. Okay, so think of him as a possible
Okay, the question is that Chris Hedges claims that he's not an engineer. Who are you directing that?
I just wanted to mention this to Kevin Barrett. If you want a debater, see if you can get Chris Hedges. He might be a little more available than...
Yeah. Well, I've tried Hedges, and yeah, he punts. He's not an engineer, and I guess he doesn't have eyes either because he can't look at Building 7 and see. Okay.
And you know about Christopher Bolin and his book, Solving 9/11, where he gives the deep history of the Mossad's involvement in all the Israeli companies.
The woman in the back with the camera.
Yeah, thank you so much for your informative presentation. The collapse, the demolition is actually military grade. That's why it's so impressive, because they had access to materials you can't get like on eBay or something, What I wanted to say about Chomsky is he said if there was ever a peer-reviewed article, about the science of physics, then I would take a look at it. But there has been by Niels Harrit, who published his findings on the explosive residue in nanothermite, and it wasn't. No one challenged him on the facts. They tried to attack him. And he won a lawsuit, a defamation lawsuit, because they attacked him, ad hominem attacks, because they can't actually refute the facts. So that's one thing. There is a peer-reviewed evidence. And just the other thing was, not since McCarthyism have we seen this sort of you were talking about the risks of 9/11, but I think self-censorship is a huge risk when you shut down and suspend critical thinking to go along with the groupthink herd mentality, prevailing narrative, whatever, because that's easier. So that to me is a very insidious and long-term harmful effect. And thank you for your sacrifices to bring people the truth.
But you have a question, or are you saying...
Well, the 28 pages is very important, but at the same time possibly misleading, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay, gentlemen, that's right.
So two things. One more point. Chomsky said it doesn't matter that 9/11 only killed 3,000 because you got to scale 60 million since World War II. Well, the next 60 million are because of 9/11. The wars that are started are going to kill, maybe not 60, but the next several million.
That's a good point. We're broadcasting. Yeah. The observation was that Chomsky says 3,000 people on 9/11 is nothing compared to 60 million since World War II killed by the U.S. And the point is, well, the next 60 million are going to be because of 9/11. That's an excellent point.
So, and the question is, he also refuted the idea of the Bush administration behind because it wasn't Iraqis. Well, we see the advantage of it being Saudi Arabia now with the 28 pages, that they are serving as a firewall. That there's resistance to revealing it because they own our they own our debt. We have very strong intelligence relationships with them. That there's a dual interest to not let it go too deep. That they protect us in a way. So that's another idea.
Yes.
I think these are fantastic observations, but what we really probably could use for the broadcast, to make the broadcast work, is like really short questions, because we have to repeat a very short question and then answer it so people can hear it.
What's your best opinion on why the Council on Arabic Relations hasn't come out to say that no Muslim could have possibly done 9/11?
Okay, the question is, why hasn't the Council on Islamic American Relations, CAIR, come out to pointed out that no Muslim could have done 9/11? That's a great question. I was part of the Million Muslim March on Washington, D.C. on September 11th a couple of years ago, and it was one of the greatest media hosts in all history. It was just MD Alam, him, and then me and one or two other guys. None of us had any money, and we just put out a press release saying 1 million Muslims are going to march for 9/11 truth on 9/11 in Washington, D.C. And of course, Fox News ate it up, and we got millions of dollars worth of free publicity out of it. But how many people showed up? Well, the estimates range from 20 to 100, depending on how you count. And meanwhile, there were several thousand bikers, anti-Muslim bikers, who showed up, to threaten to beat up the evil 9/11 truth Muslims. So I think that experience illustrates that Muslims in the U.S. are really running scared. They've been terrorized even more than everybody else into submission, and they all know. I mean, I was the only Muslim in Madison, Wisconsin that I knew that didn't know it was an inside job for 2 years. It took me 2 years to figure it out. All of my Muslim friends in the Madison, Wisconsin Muslim community all strongly suspected inside job, and I was open to that. It took me 2 years to realize they were right, but they're afraid.
Are there any questions directed at Barbara?
Yes.
Okay.
So, Barbara worked in the U.S. government, and Kevin, I'd also like your opinion, but especially hers. Where does she see the strategic vision of these acts going? Where are they trying to take us with these acts? What's their end game?
Okay, the question is directed to Barbara. The gentleman wants to know, what's the end game for all these attacks?
Barbara left.
She's it. Oh, good.
I think I don't know if there's a single end game. I'm the kind of quote-unquote conspiracy theorist that just thinks I think conspiracies are ubiquitous. It's normal human behavior to try to optimize our own self-interest by working with other people. What else does anybody ever do? So there are many different groups of competing and cooperating, power-hungry groups, and so but I do think that there's this neocon / neoliberal cabal that is trying to create the world's first world-encompassing empire, one world empire that will be basically run on neoliberal economic principles, and some would call this a new world order in which the vast majority of people are reduced to the state of slaves or serfs, while the masters consist of the banksters and their hired guns, their hired experts and technology experts and so on. And frankly, that's been, that's called an Alex Jones-style conspiracy theory, but I think it really looks pretty plausible to me that that's what they want. Clearly, they are trying to take over the entire world, and clearly they're pushing this neoliberal agenda. So you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see the handwriting on the wall.
Michael Moore is quoted as saying that he doesn't believe in conspiracy theories, only the ones that are true. Anyway, next. Yes, sir.
Chomsky in the 80s was campaigning for the
war aids at the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who he said were fighting with rusty rifles and pitchforks at the very time that they were receiving over $1 billion a year through Brzezinski. In the 90s, he was campaigning for U.S. Intervention in Bosnia and Serbia, which signed a New York Times ad to that effect and so on. The whole civil war that was created by the United States. So my point is simply that this pattern goes, and we could go back to the 60s where he was debating with Buckley, the known CIA agent, as the official voice of the peace movement, you see. And this is how he's been playing a role in the deep state as an agent for many, many decades.
Okay, the question is, could Chomsky be an agent of the deep state given his support for U.S. intervention through LCIA against the Russians in the 1980s,
in Bosnia and Eastern Europe, going back to the 1960s when he was debating with William Buckley as the opposite of Buckley? Is he just playing a role? Well, that's the hypothesis that we get from Barry Zwicker. And anybody who wants to follow up on this discussion of Chomsky really should read the chapter, a big chapter in Towers of Deception, the media cover-up of 9/11 by Barry Zwicker, one of Canada's leading media analysts, the kind of guy who should be a headliner at this conference, but because he's pursuing the truth on these issues, they probably won't invite him. Anyway, yeah, Barry makes a very strong argument that Chomsky could be an agent of the deep state because it's often on the most critical issues, such as 9/11 and the JFK assassination, where he has done the most to mislead people from following a path that could have challenged the real powers that be. So.
Yes, sir.
So we said that not only Chomsky, but other people on the left, like Amy Goodman, you cannot talk about 9/11. And so my question is what is the nature of the pressure, or what are the threats that they are
able to exert to prevent these people from talking about it?
Well, the question is, what kind of threats are used to prevent people like Amy Goodman from talking about
9/11? And that's actually the very question I addressed in an article I published yesterday, was it? Boy, time goes fast, at Veterans Today. And so you're welcome to go to veteranstoday.com and read the article. And the thesis was that it's all about money. Amy Goodman witnessed the controlled demolition of Building 7. You can watch the film of her watching it and then turning and fleeing. And yet she never reported on it and certainly never followed up. Shortly after 9/11, she accepted a grant of about $500,000, I understand, from the Ford Foundation, which is a CIA front. One of the reasons I'm where I am now instead of in a professorship is that I turned down a Ford Foundation grant at the University of California when I was right out of graduate school that would have had me surveilling African Muslims for the Ford Foundation. Was, they didn't use the word surveil, but that's what it would have amounted to. So anyway, yeah, there's all kinds of foundation money supporting much of what we call the left. And a lot of people call that the foundation-funded pseudo-alternative left. It's basically people who have a really nice, cushy place at the table. Amy Goodman is a multimillionaire. She's taking in more than $1 million a year through her Pacifica stuff. She's got subscriptions all over the country. She's very, very wealthy and has a huge audience. And someone like Bonnie Faulkner, who is working out of Pacifica as well, who puts out a vastly superior product, in my humble opinion, is having a hard time surviving. It has a much smaller audience. Why? Because Amy Goodman is playing ball with these foundations. And what is foundation money? Foundation money is, as Kat said, the 1% of the 1%. I mean, the really wealthy elite, they put their money into the foundations. Soros and people like that. Soros is funding so much of the left. So I think it's really all about money. And the message is, if you talk about this, bad things can happen to you financially. Like, I'm not really that afraid that they're going to assassinate me. I figure that's not very likely. But I lost a lot of money for talking about this, and so have a lot of other people. It's not good for your career prospects. So there's this money control system, and I think that's the main issue here. Yeah. Oh, Barbara's back. Okay. Question for Barbara.
Okay, do any questions for Barbara? She's back online.
Yeah.
Okay, you one.
The question that I had for Barbara, I think you're going to have to repeat it, is since you worked in the government, what do you see their strategic vision is? Where are they taking us with these acts? What is their exit strategy?
Okay, the question is to Barbara, directed to Barbara Honegger, and based on the fact that she was working within government circles, what does she say or feel or see as what their ultimate aim and goals are?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. My computer froze up, so I had to go and restart. So hi, everybody. Yes, well, you're asking for an educated opinion. I think that Kevin's opinion might be a little more educated, but I was inside the federal government for about 20 years. White House, Department of Justice, 16 years as a senior military affairs journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School here in Monterey, California, where I'm running for Congress. And the Department of Defense builds the Naval Postgraduate School, also known as NPS, as the Department of Defense premier national security, science and technology and national security graduate University of the Department of Defense. So you can imagine being the senior military affairs journalist there for over a decade and a half. It was a pretty high level and very highly paid position. And the strange thing, I just want to go on record, is that I don't quite understand why I seem to be an exception to this rule, a kind of white crow. But I never really had a problem. The entire time from 9/11 on, I have been in my job. I only retired about 3 years ago from this very high level position. I never had a problem, like everyone else seems to have, for speaking the truth. And I have to tell you that I believe that that has to be, although this is a very educated guess, that has to be because someone very high up in the Navy, which of course runs the Naval Postgraduate School, it's a function of the United States Navy, knows the truth about 9/11 and actually wants the truth to come out. And after all, I didn't mention in my my earlier presentation, but the Naval Command Center was actually targeted by these inside the building explosives on 9/11. And according to the official story, even though it's false, the official story in the 9/11 Commission, and if you talk to Keenan Hamilton, the co-chair, and the members of the commission, and all of official Washington, they will tell you that 42 of the 43 individuals, military staff, who were in the Naval Command Center 2 and 3 rings inside the Pentagon, 2 and 3 rings further in than the official story says a plane hit on the outside ring, that they all died, 42 of 43. And we know that that was targeted with inside the building explosives. So it has to be that someone very high up was actually protecting me. He said, "Leave her alone," for which I'm immensely grateful, you can imagine. But anyway, I wanted to give that context because I do have very high-level experience in the federal government. That doesn't make me an expert on the answer to your question. However, I'll give you my opinion. I believe that the people who are behind 9/11, obviously, believe their own propaganda. We're talking about the Project for New American Century Zionist neocons and the Israeli right wing, the Likud right wing in Israel, and the bankers, the Zionist bankers around the world. And they believe that it is their destiny to take over the world. And that 9/11 was their seminal moment, their seminal act to do so, and it was, from their point of view, a magnificent success. I actually agree with the statement in the Grand Chessboard of Brzezinski that the great game is to take the great Eurasian landmass. And, in my opinion, thank God for Putin, because he has thrown a monkey wrench into this plan by what he did with the Crimea, the unconscionable coup using actual Nazis. Actual Nazis in the Ukraine was supposed to be the next domino. All of Ukraine was supposed to be the next domino surrounding Russia. So I believe that their goal is to take over the entire Eurasian landmass on their way to controlling the world. But they have been blocked. And the great success of the 9/11 truth movement has been magnificently successful. I believe that a poll many years ago already had 89, almost 90%, nearly 100% of the German population knowing that not only the official story of 9/11 was false, and that's the most important and wealthy country in the EU, for anyone knows that. So they lead the European Union. People in Europe know the truth. People in the Middle East know the truth. It's essentially only in the United States that we still have the job to do. People in Canada know the truth. People in Australia know the truth. It's the United States that we have to target to get the truth to a critical mass of the American people. And that's why this opening in the left forum is so critically important. I hope that is a nutshell answer to your question.
Any other questions? Oh, by the window.
Yes, thank you so much to us for a wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask two questions. One, I wanted to point out that when I speak to 9/11 truth skeptics, I often have people that can completely get behind the controlled demolition idea. They are totally in awe when they hear about Building 7. As you guys know, many people don't even know that happened. And they also can get behind how the footage of the Pentagon photographs are not conclusive. But when they also get to the point that they ask me, these things are too sloppy and too ridiculous for it to just be in plain sight in this way, and there must be something that 9/11 troopers do not know about this.
Second question?
Yes.
Okay, the question is essentially,
Why so sloppy?
were they in fact sloppy, or did they have something else in mind?
What I'm saying is many 9/11 truth skeptics believe that the evidence, that the fact that there were controlled demolitions randomly at Building 7 and the fact that the Pentagon footage shows so obviously that it was not the original story, it seems too apparent that there were plans and that something was going on, and that there must be something going on that 9/11 troopers aren't missing. The U.S. government cannot be this stupid, basically. And I'm wondering what your response would be to that.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting. It's kind of the counterpart of the other approach, which says that you hear this from libertarians, that the government can't do anything. How could they do something as huge as 9/11 successfully? But then you look at the evidence, and then you ask the opposite question: how could they do it so sloppily?
I've been hearing this response so often.
Yeah, it's shocking. Well, you know, my response when I first really looked at this stuff in late 2003 was, wow, this is so in your face. This is not even debatable. There's no it was shockingly clear, obvious, and that does raise questions. And I think most plausibly this is a type of covert operation that's been developed historically. The Kennedy assassination, for example, I mean, they could have just put poison in his toothpaste, which is a common, or toothbrush, I guess. That's how they killed Hoover. But no, they had to do this really elaborate, ambush scenario with whoever knows how many shooter teams, and capturing the Zapruder film to alter it, and sending every bad guy in the world to Dallas, and having Nixon there, and Bush there, and Howard Hunt there, and all of this. It's really obvious. There's so much, that ludicrous single bullet theory and all of this stuff. That methodology worked for them because it led to such complexity in the discussion of the truth, in a way, the outrageous truth. The truth being, it's like a Hitler-style big lie, that the people will believe a small lie because they themselves tell small lies, but a really big lie that's this outrageous, it's impossible. Yeah, how could they do something this huge and this in your face? So I think that's part of how they get away with it. There's a second theory, though, which I don't fully endorse. That in fact the controversy between the truth seekers and the establishment is actually part of what they want. Now, why would that be? Possibly the overall social effect of that could be to send this message that we'll never really know anything. We'll never a disempowering message. Right, that we can't really know the full reality. If they did this, as Chomsky said, they would have to be all-powerful. So basically, that if we don't really succeed in reopening the case, we're not really hurting them very much by doing what we're doing.
Is it possible also that they know we know, they want us to know, because they're threatening us, we can do it again?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Yeah, if we could kill the president in broad daylight, what's the use of you trying to stand up against us? Yeah.
One sentence question for Barbara.
I'd like to
Lieutenant Schaefer was the only Navy man in the Pentagon to live. He died on the table 3 times. Have you reached out to him? Have you spoken to Schaefer to get a revised affidavit? Lieutenant Schaefer.
At the Pentagon?
Yes.
He lives. He lives today.
He continues to live, and the question again is? Has Barbara reached out to him? Have you ever spoken with him?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I will answer that question, and I do have an answer to it, but I would first like to jump in and give an answer to the previous question. I've actually talked to David Ray Griffin, Professor David Ray Griffin, the magnificent dean of the 9/11 Truth Movement worldwide, author of, I believe, 11 books on 9/11. And he and I agree, and he had thought of it independently, that the kind of in-your-face nature of both the JFK assassination and 9/11, in conjunction with all of the strange aspects of it that don't seem to make sense, that look like they're mistakes, that kind of thing. That it was all quite pre-planned, and that of course, the withholding of the evidence. The FBI controls all the evidence. There are no videos. Think about it. For the Pentagon, it's rather strange that there are all these videos that hit you over and over and over again and go deep into your unconscious psyche from the World Trade Center, the iconic moment of the plane impact and then later the collapse of the buildings, where you're supposed to believe there's a causal link, which we've proven there isn't and cannot be physically. But there are no videos of the Pentagon. Well, that's very interesting. And they're withholding the evidence. The FBI is all of it at the Pentagon. Anything that matters. There were just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of video cameras in and around the Pentagon that have not been released, and the only two short ones that have been released, of course, really don't show a plane at all. So what's interesting, what Professor Griffin and I talked about, is the official documents, videos, especially about the Pentagon, on 9/11 are contradictory. But that's part of the design. I used to call Iran Gate Iran-Contra, Iran Contradiction Gate. And so the whole design is to this so-called cognitive dissonance, that's a nice academic word, for all kinds of contradictory official evidence and official claims that are designed intentionally to paralyze serious investigators of these events and to try to make them give up. So that's my answer to the first question, but it's not working, is it? Because we have seen through their smoke curtains, and we have seen through to the truth, and we are never going to give up. And until we have the full evidence, we have the full proper interpretation, truthful interpretation, and the real perpetrators are brought to justice, and they know this. They are scared of us. I mean, let's remember that. One of the things I learned in Washington is that officialdom, people in the government are actually terrified of the unified American people. So we have to just keep getting the truth out, finding it and getting it out. And because this is a zero-sum game, if we never give up, we will win. It's just a matter of time. We may not know precisely the event that triggers the sudden paradigm shift back to a mentality of September 10th, as opposed to post-September 11th, but that's what we need. Sometimes I feel like I'm Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and I actually have a little, fuzzy black dog, wiry black dog named Waldo. And I turn and I say, Waldo, Toto, I don't think we're in America anymore since 9/11. Well, we're not, and that's by design. But we need to get back to America. We need to get back to the both conscious and unconscious mentality and understanding of September 10th before any of this happened. And I actually think it would be a very wise thing for us to do to begin a very conscious and explicit 9/10 movement, September 10th movement in this country to achieve just that. So now to Kevin Schaefer. First off, it's a misunderstanding and a lie that Kevin Schaefer was the only survivor of the Naval Command Center. As I mentioned, that is simply the official story at the Naval Command Center inside the Pentagon. In fact, and you learn this in Behind the Smoke Curtain on YouTube, and I gave the link earlier, but if you didn't write it down, just go to YouTube and put in Behind the Smoke Curtain, And you'll just click on the one at the top that has almost 200,000 views. In behind the smoke curtain, you will see, and I will repeat it here, that I interviewed the admiral who was in charge of the Naval Command Center on 9/11. He came to the Naval Postgraduate School, where I was the senior military affairs journalist. I interviewed him, and I told him, I started the conversation by saying, well, sir, did you know that Kevin Schaefer, according to the government, was the only survivor of the Naval Command Center, and he was a curricular officer right here at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I had actually met him as part of one of the stories that I did at one time, and he was at the Naval Postgraduate School just before going to the Pentagon, where he was in the Naval Command Center on 9/11. And the Admiral Hathaway, he said, well, that's not true. He said, I was running the Naval Command Center. That is not true. He said, in the hardened intelligence cell room inside the Naval Command Center, there were 18 or 19 naval intelligence staffers, and the majority of them also survived on 9/11, in addition to Kevin Schaefer. So do you think that it is a coincidence that the Pentagon itself and the government, the 9/11 Commission official lie report, states that Kevin Schaefer was the only survivor of the Naval Command Center inside the building explosion, I add, in the Naval Command Center on 9/11 when he was not, number one. And number two, do you think it's a coincidence that the same individual they falsely claim was the only survivor of the Naval Command Center on 9/11 was hired after he survived, and he was burned over something like 50% of his body and went through a very long surgeries and physical therapy, but he came back miraculously. He was then hired by the 9/11 Commission, by the Team 8, the most important subgroup, investigative subgroup staff of the 9/11 Commission that were investigating everything that had to do with the military response, and I would add non-response, of course, on 9/11, including the Pentagon attack. So this is not a coincidence. As far as your question of whether I've interviewed him, not since 9/11, but I know that he was part of the 9/11 Commission Team 8 cover-up. So there wouldn't be too much point of doing that, but he was at the Naval Postgraduate School with me, if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everybody for coming, and there are a number of additional deep state panels you can get up here, and thank you for your attendance and excellent questions.